Well, look, to start, I want to acknowledge that the city of Greater Bendigo is on the Dja Wurrung and Tangarang country, whose ancestors and their descendants are the traditional owners of this country. We acknowledge that they've been the custodians for many centuries, and they continue to perform age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. And we acknowledge their living culture and their unique role in the life of this region. Well, I'm Rai Gaita, and I'm incredibly pleased to be here with my dear friend Alex, talking about some books that I love. There are three books that are identified, and Alex identifies as his Queensland, Central Queensland novels. The first one is Journey to the Stone Country, then Landscape of Farewell, and Coal Creek. And you can see I've really done my homework. I was not doing my homework. As though I read these books for the first time. But I've got all these little stickies in them, and which is good, but I don't know which sticky refers to what sometimes. But I want to start off reading something from Landscape of Farewell, because it captures something beautiful about the quality of Alex's writing. I mean, not just the bit I'm going to read, but just more generally. And it's in a section where a warrior, Napam, is leading some indigenous fighters to what he knows to be a massacre of white settlers who have desecrated the land in their sense of things. And I just want to read you this passage. Napam has observed that the leader's son, that's the leader of the white settlement, who's a devout Christian, leader's son sometimes rides far into the scrub to the south of the camp during the heat of the day, and he knows that he goes in search of a sign of the approach of his brothers and their party, hoping they'll soon arrive to strengthen him against his father. Napam says nothing of this to the others, but falls silent. Looking over the assembled warriors, he senses their eagerness for him to inspire them with a hot desire to kill the strangers being the settlers. And so he addresses them with the words that come naturally into his heart at this moment, and which he's well satisfied will rouse their spirits to the fierce heat that's required if a man is to kill another human being, which he knows is not an easy thing to do. "We're not going to leave a single one of them alive," he cries out, and he shakes the long shaft of his favoured spear until it hums menacingly and fills the air by the waterhole with the sound of the great red hornet, promising the fiery sting of battle. "We're not going to leave a single one of them alive," he cries, "down to the babies in their mothers' wombs. Not even they must live. The whole people must be wiped out of existence, and none to be left to think of them and shed a tear." Napam turns to the tall messenger who stands at his side, and he lays his hand on the messenger's shoulder and offers him the privilege of killing the leader's son, whose hand is never far from his gun. The tall messenger smiles, and the young men look at him with respect and envy, eager to see on the day how he'll perform his task. "I shall deal with the leader myself," Napam says, "for he and I are brothers, and we know this is the way it is to be decided between us." Now, that leads to this passage, which I particularly wanted to read to you. The young men possess only a kind of vague poetic sense of what Napam might mean by this puzzling claim to be the brother of the leader of the strangers. They do not ask him for any further explanation of his meaning, for they trust that if he wished them to have a fuller sense of his extraordinary claim at this time, he would give it to them without them needing to ask it from him. They are confident that one day the fullness of Napam's meaning would become clear to them. One day, if they survive the battle long after these events, when they're old men and are walking alone through their own country, thinking of nothing in particular, an understanding of Napam's meaning will suddenly blossom in their minds, like the rare flower of the moon tree that blooms only once in a man's lifetime. And they will know what Napam meant when he stood before them and told them the leader of the strangers and he were brothers. Well, I think you'll agree that that's just a very beautiful piece of writing, but it resonates at so many levels. And one of the reasons I thought I'd pick it is because I'll just read you now one paragraph of something I wrote in an essay about Landscape of Farewell, in a book of essays in Alex's honour. In the years since I first read Landscape of Farewell, I've done what Napam's messengers did. I have trusted Alex and his words, knowing them to be wise words that come from a deep understanding and love of humanity. I did not interrogate them. I allowed them to enter in their own way and time into my own feelings and thoughts about the Holocaust, about Australia's Indigenous peoples, and about what it can mean to be terrified by the suspicion that someone one loves might be guilty of terrible crimes by deed or by omission. It was, as I always knew, it would be, trust rewarded. Well, that expresses the way I have felt about a lot of Alex's writings. I mean, you can read it. You can read it at one level and just not skate through it, but be excited by it, and read through it all the time, because it often has such wonderful and exciting and suspenseful qualities. But it has so many different layers of meaning, such that when you're puzzled about it, you can either try to press it or do as the men in that passage do, trust that as you live your life, these words will resonate through your life and your understanding of their subject will deepen. So one of the reasons I think this is possible with Alex's work, why it has that real depth, and why so many people often ask, especially about his description of the North Queensland landscape and of the Indigenous peoples there and the white settlers who've been there, how he has managed to do it so well, to capture it so truthfully in so much detail. Then it has seemed to me that one reason this is so is, and now I'll let Alex talk about this. One reason it is so is that at a certain time when he was a young writer, a man who had a great influence on his life, said after reading Alex's first attempt at a novel, which this man apparently didn't care for too much, Alex says that he'd given this man, whose name was Max Flood, the novel to read, and that Max had read it day and in the evening, and that Alex woke up one morning with a thud as he threw down, as Max threw down the novel next to Alex's ear in bed, and said, "Why don't you write about what you love?" And the imperative implicit in that question, in fact it wasn't imperative, it was a rhetorical question, is, I think, what that Alex has honoured that imperative, been obedient to that imperative, shows in the fact that it's love in his writing that gives it its particular quality of truthfulness and, of course, such observant detail, because if you love something, you tend to closely. Alex?
No, just keep going, Ray. There's nobody I would rather hear talk about my work than Ray. And Ray and I haven't colluded on this particular meeting. We haven't talked about, until we just met up in the green room then before coming on, we didn't talk about what we were going to talk about. Ray said he wanted to talk about these books, and I said, good. And Rob Mann had asked us, would you do that? And we both said, yes. That's it. That was it. There was no preparation. But in fact, I had prepared something rather similar to what Ray has just said, in the sense of just a couple of bits of text that I wanted to highlight for a couple of reasons that Ray himself has now covered in his own way. And when Ray wrote that piece for the symposium a couple of years ago in Sydney, he begins it by saying, apologetically, I'm not a literary critic. No, thank God for that. Because also what he has to say is from the heart, and it stands the test of time and reflection, as things from the heart usually do. That particular piece that Ray read, that Napun is quoting the father of Western poetry, Homer, when he says, we're not going to leave a single one of them alive, not even the babies in their mother's wombs. It's from the Iliad. It was written nearly 3,000 years ago. That is in an earlier, it's also in the novel. It's an ironic statement coming from him, coming from this Aboriginal. There's a vast wealth of irony involved in the fact that I give those words to him as a person, as a poet, as a man to be celebrated, not perhaps by Western people, but certainly by Indigenous people. And when those two celebrations coincide, that is when things begin to make a bit of sense. Some people have wondered, why did you use this quote from the Iliad? It's in the early part of the book on page 13. I was just going to read it so I know what page it was on. And it's quoted by this Professor Max Otto, who is a professor of German history. And he gives a lecture on massacre, without mentioning the Holocaust, of course. And he chooses a passage from the father of Western poetry, according to the great critic Curtius, whose work I love. He says, here's the words of the father of our poetry. And that was there not to make a comparison with the Holocaust. There is nothing to which we can compare the Holocaust. It is unique in a very specific way. And but what he does is to demonstrate, if you like, to his German audience and to others visiting, including an Australian woman, that the Holocaust has asked us this vast question to which we have no answer. And that is, until the Holocaust, it was assumed that, and even in my childhood, and I was born in 1936, before the war, even in my childhood, the sense that we were making progress, humanity was making some moral progress, was pretty well implicit in all historical writing. In much historical writing, very, very few historians, sociologists, and biographers really. I mean, there were famous books like Decline of the West and those books, but there was a sense in which we were making moral progress. Certainly, our teachers considered that to be the case. The Holocaust asks the question: is it possible for humanity, for humankind, to make moral progress? Because here we are, 3,000 years after the Iliad, after the writing of the Iliad, and we've made no progress at all. So that was the reason it's there, not as a comparison, but as a reflection on the failure of humankind to have made any moral progress during that time. Despite Christianity, Rai and I will disagree about this, but I say despite Christianity. The other thing, I suppose, I got some of the, I just want to read perhaps a couple of these things. I was fortunate, I'll just read this because I said it, I wrote it here rather than just saying it off the cuff now, but it's really important to me that I was fortunate to come of age in Australia as a boy of 16 when my fellow people of my age were doing year 11 and 12 and getting ready to go to the university. I arrived alone in Australia and went up north to work on cattle stations, and the Aborigines who I contacted then were tribal people. They hadn't had equal pay, so they weren't removed yet from their land. They were still on their tribal land. And I was fortunate to come of age in Australia at a time and in a place where Aborigines weren't viewed as a dying race, as they were in the cities of the south in the 50s, but were abundant in numbers and were at the very centre of the work that I was undertaking. So that was my first impression of Australia and of Australian Aborigines. I knew nothing about racism or the history of the sense that these people are a dying race, which of course they're not. And for Australians of my generation, there are these two things that Rai has immediately locked onto in these books, and they pervade our emotions and our attitudes and the way we experience art and life. The Holocaust is one of these things to which we have no answer and no understanding, and the confusion of childhood feelings of guilt and shame that we associate with it, certainly I do, that will never leave us. And another is the terrible price that Australian Indigenous people have been required to pay for the prosperity and the opportunities enjoyed by people such as me. I'm a beneficiary of the dispossession. As a novelist, it's not possible. I can't see how it can be possible for me as a novelist and a thinking person to write as if these two things didn't exist and weren't part of my life. They are embedded too deeply in my experience and my psyche, so I can't help writing about them. As part of the job of a novelist, it seems to me, is to do that sort of thing, to write about what you love and what exercises your sense of community. Yeah.
In a moment, I'd like to talk about a journey to the Stone Country, but since we're talking a little bit about the Holocaust, one of the things that I think is truly remarkable about Landscape of Farewell is that it's a very deeply reflective novel. It reflects about the massacre of white people by Napam and his warriors, and indeed sort of celebrates Napam as a great general, implicitly decrying the fact that this has not been recognised. And I know that the massacre that sort of was the template for this was one often talked about but derided in Queensland. But it is, as Alex said, it's about a German historian who tries but can't write about massacre. Who's desperately afraid, in a way, desperate to find out, but desperate also to avoid finding out the truth about what his father did in the Holocaust. And the massacre, on the one hand, by Napam, where he speaks those terrible words, but those words are then nestled in the remark that these are his brothers which of course Menelaus in the Iliad could never have said. The tone in which those exact same words are said by Menelaus as he's about to head off to sack Troy, and the way in which Napalm speaks them are utterly different in their spirit. But when we hear that terrible reference to the people, they must not survive, of course that does immediately bring up thoughts about the Holocaust, the attempt to exterminate the Jews wherever it was possible to do it. But again, nothing remotely connected to the spirit of Napalm's talk, because they were conceived to be vermin, hardly because, in some sense or other, they could be thought to be brothers. And the novel is reflective about what it means to tell the truth about these things, especially what it might mean to tell the truth in a story. But this is the remarkable achievement. In none of that deep reflectiveness in this book, and this is true of all of Alex's books, but it's most remarkable here because this is so obviously one of the most reflective of his books. There's not a trace of didacticism. And so the Holocaust comes in, and then there's a thought about what happened to the indigenous peoples, what happened to them, and what they did. And somehow each of these stories deepens the other. They're there in the book together, but not ever sort of compared. And that's partly why I said at the beginning that if you were to ask, well, what does Alex Miller think about the relation between what happened to the indigenous peoples and also what they did and what happened in the Holocaust, you would have to unpack all this very, very slowly, it having deepened in you through your trusting the story and through trusting whatever connections emerge as a consequence of that trusting. That's what I feel is so wonderful and remarkable about this. Most reflective novels also have traces of a didacticism in them, especially when they tackle such big and great themes as Alex does in Landscape. And there's not a trace of didacticism. He is the least didactic of writers. But perhaps in the case of Journey to the Stone Country, there's also a terrible discovery by one of the characters of what her grandfather was involved in, the killings of indigenous peoples. And that awakening in her comes in a story told to her by a woman, and it's told very, very brutally and with great hatred and bitterness. And I thought we might talk a little bit about that, and maybe I could read a little bit, or you read a little bit, about Alpanya's. Perhaps what you could very briefly tell us what leads up to, I know it takes hundreds of pages in the novel, to what leads up to her extraordinary speech in this book, which is it's just spellbinding and shocking and frightening.
Thanks, Ray. I think, as you suggested, it takes a while to lead up to Panya's final revelations and her accusations of the hero, in a sense, of the novel, which is Bo Rennie, if you've read it. He's the guy who, in a sense, the book is really about. And he's a friend of mine, Cole McLennan, and he is the bloke who really got me to write that book. And it was a journey that I undertook with him and with Annabelle. But Panya exposes him, the hero, in a sense, Cole, Bo, as being a fraud, as being less than a complete Jenga man. His grandmother, she says, was the last woman to be born to be given birth to in the Stone Country. And he has let down the people. She says, you bring this woman to see me, and this woman's grandfather, I remember him, I remember him. She says, he's the one who did it. He and his mates, they went out there and they killed the boys and they killed the girls. We hid in an old dried up bullock, dead bullock. We hid in the carcass, in the framework, in the rib cage. We saw them doing it. And she accuses him of betraying them. So this is part of the politics, I suppose, that I came across in travelling with Col and Liz in the north, up in the highlands there. Beautiful country where I worked as a boy. And Col had said, come on up and I'll show you my country. And that was what the book was. It was the story of our travels at that time together. And I left myself out of it, of course. And Col is exposed as a bit of a dandy, sort of fancies himself a bit, rolls a smoke and stands there with his cowboy hat just tilted nicely back a little bit, you know, and winks at the girls. And he also is going around with this white woman whose relations back in the old days. I mean, he's about joining in and being part of society the way it is today. Not reconciliation. None of them believe in reconciliation. That's a white idea, so that we don't have to recompense them, which is much more expensive and trying and difficult for us to do. Remember our good mate, Rudd, when he was trying to get elected in Queensland. I was going around Queensland at the same time spruiking my book as he was going around spruiking his party and himself. And Howard had just said, I'll give you $37 billion refund on your taxes. And Rudd said, oh, I'll give you $34 billion. And I thought, what a visionary we're about to get. You know, what an opportunity was there for somebody to seriously put forward for the first time in our history a new plan for righting the wrongs, for recompensing, for creating genuine educational facilities, genuine work situations and genuine health situations on a par with our own. The kind of thing that $34 billion could start looking serious about. But no, it was to come back to us, the middle class people who are already enjoying all the good clean stuff and having good fun. And I thought then, that's when I first called him Rudd the Dud on Queensland, and we were sort of following each other around. And presumably hated my guts. Good. I hope he did. Very glad to see him go. Oh, why am I talking about Australian politics? Well, if my publisher were here, and she's not, thankfully, she would be starting to get a little bit annoyed because I haven't mentioned Coal Creek.
Yes, but
I don't think that these are opportunities really for spruiking your books so much. I kind of disagree with the idea that writing festivals are really sales conferences. I think they're for talking about the things that you've spent your lifetime involved with and the values that you're dealing with, rather than simply the latest book and why it's better than all the others. But anyway, that's all right. And Australian politics is part of it, isn't it? How can one possibly escape from the way in which the country is governed and the sort of vision that is brought to the governing of the country by the various people we elect? And thankfully we can get rid of them again, as we do.
Can I just read a bit?
Sure. Ray is trying to get this back off me, so...
No. No, I want this is, I've lost my book shut. I just want to read you this wonderful, it's frightening. Panya crowed with laughter. No, see, too busy, big note. This is about Cole, as Alex describes him. Too busy big noting yourself around them white people to see nothing. Your grandma seen it wasn't worth telling you nothing. We've been waiting for you, Bo Rennie. We knew you was coming back. That Beck woman, that's Annabelle in the story, with whom Cole has fallen in love, actually, and Annabelle with him. That Beck woman you got with you must have got down on her knees to you, did she? Covered her hair in dust and tore off her shirt and begged you to forgive her for what her people done to our people? That's how come you got her with you? She begged you to forgive her for the killing, busting open the skull of my poor little brother? She laughed and coughed, choking on her tears before regaining her breath. No one never came here and asked me to forgive him. I never heard nothing from none of them. They knew where I was living all these years, but not one of them, Becks or Biggs, ever come by and asked me to forgive them. All they want to do is forget. They want us to believe the bad times is over and we all got to be friends now. Only they got everything for themselves and they're not giving it back. That's what the white man now wants, peace for himself, and that's what you're going to give him. But that's not what I'm going to give him. Let's all be friends, he says, as if nothing ever happened. And if some of us don't want to be friends, we're a trouble to him and in the wrong again. She was silent a moment. There's going to be no peace for him. I'm used to being in the wrong, so it doesn't matter to me. I give him the slip a long time ago and he won't catch me now. We're different from them, boy, and we're always going to be different from them, and you know that, Bo Rennie. The white man never wants to hear nothing about what's different from him. What's different don't interest him. He don't see it. He don't know how to respect what's different from him. He just wants to explain everything his own way and forget what he's done. But I'm never going to forget. He thinks he got nothing to fear from a broken down old Jenga woman like me, but that's the mistake he made before. He's just making it again, the same old mistake. That's what he does. He thinks it's all over. He thinks he won. She cackled. You forget, and you're one of them, as good as a murderer of your own people. Is that you, Bo Rennie? Do they forget their own dead? Well, they don't. Look at that Gallipoli stuff they go on about. They don't forget. So what makes them think we're going to forget? Now you get out of Panya's house. This story's not over yet. The old people not finished yet. That Les Murrah and my aunt are here. They're going to fight this war for another 1,000 years. Where's the white fella going to be in 1,000 years? He's the one got to worry about that, not us. We still going to be here. Very powerful writing. I want to get back, talk to Alex about that passage, but let me just give read to you the highest praise that could be given of it. It was again at this conference, and Frank Budbee, who was, as it were, the prototype for Dougal in Landscape of Llewellyn, Dougal also in Journey to the Stone Country. And there's a conversation between Dougal and Annabelle was there, Liz Hattie. Cole unfortunately couldn't be there, but so Elizabeth Wethy asks this question about that very as she rightly puts it, confronting passage. It's very confronting, but it's also an incredible character. So is there an original for Panya? We've heard about the others, and Frank had been saying how wonderfully accurate these portraits are. He says it's fiction, but I recognise him straight away. And I have to say, as soon as I saw Cole McClellan, I knew him straight away from Alex's portrait of Bo Rennie. And this is what Frank Budbee says. I think she's a conglomeration, for want of a better word. I don't know all the fancy words like some academics. Yeah, a conglomeration of a lot of different people that Cole had talked to Alex about around the campfire. I have an idea who it is, but I can't sort of talk about it. She's passed on now. Elizabeth Wethy. I'm just being an ignorant white person who wants to get too much knowledge. Alex comes in. Well, as one ignorant white person to another one, when I wrote the Panya section, which took me totally by surprise, I said to Cole, I don't know where she came from. And he said, the old people gave her to you, old mate. And I think that's as good an explanation as I'm going to get. It's not only as good an explanation, it's the highest praise that could possibly have been given to Alex by his dear friend, now passed away, Frank. But it ain't over yet, is what Panya says. And I remember Alex telling me that when there was talk of reconciliation, Frank Budbee said to you, Alex, it ain't over yet.
I'm giving a lecture at the new Docklands Library on the 23rd of August, and I've given the title, The Story's Not Over Yet, which is quoting Frank. And this book, Landscape of Farewell, that Ray has been talking about, is dedicated to Frank Budbee, who is the principal elder of the Baradabana people around the Lake Elphinstone area in North Queensland. And as Ray says, he passed away earlier this year, and I was hugely honoured when the old people, the elders of his mob and his family, asked me to come up and read the eulogy, which I did, and it was a very moving situation, especially because in the end Frank was being buried in country that wasn't his own. At that point we filed past the coffin, much as you do at a Jewish funeral. There were a lot of common things in this, putting the earth in, throwing the earth in yourself. And when I got to the coffin, got to the grave site to put the earth in, a woman handed me a casket, and it was full of soil of a different kind to the soil around Mackay. And she just leaned forward and she said, "From Lake Elphinstone, Uncle." And it was his country in the casket, so I put some of that in, you know. And so all that ritual of seeing the last, in a sense also the beginning. Frank was an inspiring man, and everybody who's met him, and many of my friends have met him, including Ray and Helen Garner, and my wife and I frequently have gone up to their place, and Frank has stayed with us often. And on one occasion, that the title for my essay came from an occasion when Frank was staying with us in Castlemaine not so long ago, and we had some friends there, and one of them lamented to Frank the what they referred to as the dispossession, and Frank's response to that was, the story's not over yet. And the story is not over yet, because one of the great things that has happened toward a recompense is the land rights. The Jangga people have just got Col McLennan has just got the biggest land rights settlement in Australia ever, and we all went up to that. Ray was there too, and celebrated that with them. So that's one of the good things, because there's compensation involved from all the landowners and lessees in that Jangga area, huge area. They have to pay compensation, and that compensation goes into a fund, and the fund is being used. One thing it's being used for a lot of things, but one thing it's being used for is to send the children to private schools on the coast, where they're all getting first-class educations, and will be going on to the university and breaking the poverty cycle. And Frank restored his people, the Baradabana people. I mean, Frank was an old ringer, stockman up there, as Col was, as I was back in the 50s, and they reinvented themselves as leaders of their people, and I reinvented myself as a novelist and wrote about them as well as other things, because they were friends, because I knew them, not because I was particularly moral about it or anything like that. It was just that they were friends. You write about the friends you have inevitably, and the incidents in your life that relate to those friends. What else are you going to write about? And not being able to see you is actually quite troubling for me, because I feel as though normally when I'm talking to people, I eyeball people and you get a response, don't you? But I can't eyeball anybody out there, because I can't actually, I can see little blobs. But you're not little blobs. So I'm sorry, it's a bit hard for me to engage directly with you in a way I would like to. But
can I just want to read a little passage from this time from Landscape of Farewell, because because I want to reflect a little bit on it in a way that's is also, I think, or brings up issues that are common to this and to Journey to the Stone Country. It's Max, the man who's the historian, desperately troubled by what his father might have done as a German soldier, troubled because living with his uncle once said about his father, he's not at the front. And you get this growing sort of thought that maybe he didn't quite act decently, which develops in the thought that maybe he was involved in the most unspeakable of crimes. But there's a beautiful section here that I want to read to you. After the war was over, we held our breath in case anybody ever dared to ask such a question as the one you asked me. The question was asked by a young woman, what did your dad do in the war? It sounds a simple thing to you, but to me, to all of us, it was impossibly difficult. We just wanted to be viewed as human beings again, to be ordinary people, to be part of life and not have to apologise for being the children of our fathers. I felt all my life that I'd had to apologise for my existence. I've always known myself to have been on the wrong side. You might think there's been a small price to pay, and of course it has been. It was never that I didn't want to ask my father what he did during the war. I couldn't ask him. I did not turn around to see if she was listening to me, the young woman. The young man and the girl were gone, and the street was deserted. When he was home with us again after the war in the evening at the table doing my homework, I watched my father reading the newspaper by the fireside, and I often imagined myself asking him, Dad, what did you really do in the war? But I could never say it out loud. In this little play of mine, my father responded to my question without the least sign of tension. Why, my son? I was the captain of a company of infantrymen. They were fine soldiers, a loyal company, and we behaved as good men do, even in the terrible circumstances of war. And after this reassurance in my little play, we all breathed freely. That's what I wanted, to breathe freely. After a while, my father left me watching him, and he looked up from his newspaper and asked me if I needed help with my maths problem. He was an engineer by profession. I let him help me, even though I didn't find maths difficult and knew the answer to the problem in front of me. After he helped me, he went back to his newspaper, and the little circle of our family remained closed, the seal in place. My mother looked across at me with gratitude. Then she went on with her sewing, or she got up and gave the fire a poke and suggested we have a cup of hot chocolate before going to bed. Or sometimes she came over to me and stood behind my chair and rested her hands on my shoulders, and she looked over my homework, and in a quiet voice she congratulated me, as if it was the quality of my work that pleased her. But really, it was that I had respected our secret vow of silence. That's such a wonderfully delicate piece.
Yeah, denial is it's a strategy for survival. We often think of people in denial as being in some way morally reprehensible, but it's a strategy for survival. If what you're denying is going to make your life extraordinarily painful and difficult in a way that it isn't while you're denying. The book, A Landscape of Farewell, came to me when I was in Hamburg. I went to a conference in Hamburg, and I took with me Journey to the Stone Country, which is why I'd been invited there. And when I got, and people warned me that this Australian academic woman, Aboriginal woman, would be there, and they said, you know, she's like a really feisty person, and she's sort of the person who guards Aboriginal story and stuff, and here you've written this book about Aborigines and stuff. And I said, well, it's actually a book about white and black people, because they happen to be my friends, these people, and I was involved in the story. I haven't written a book about Aborigines, I've written a book about Australians. Anyway, I got there, and all these dark-suited German academics and other academics from Switzerland and wherever else in Europe were standing around. And they were standing around this is Warburg House, a beautiful old house that was owned originally by, of course, the Jewish family in Berlin, and who founded the Warburg Institute, but in London. But with her back to them was a woman in a cerise coat. So there was the black, this is my memory of it, a black mass of silent men, and there were a few women among them, but they were also wearing black. And with this person in a cerise coat with a scarf, a rainbow scarf kind of flicking out around her, holding up a book and yelling at them and banging the book. And it was Journey to the Stone Country. And she was saying, listen up, you guys, this is the white man getting it right. And so I was, imagine I was all set for a stoush, and I'd never met Anita Heiss before, and this was Anita in full flow, full flight, as only Anita can do it. And someone said to her, he's there behind you. And she swung around and, oh my God, you know. So we sorted that out by going out and getting drunk together. And that book, I went back to my apartment, or not apartment, a room in a hotel, which was weird. It was a huge ballroom with these two young blokes who'd just started this hotel, and said, will it be all right? And they took me into this ballroom, and there's a bed way over there. Anyway, I was sitting in this ballroom afterwards, looking out the window, and I suddenly realised there were the ingredients here for something I'd always wanted to write about. I'd always wanted to write about the Colonaringo massacre, which has been very lightly touched upon by Australian historians, including Henry Reynolds, who's a great man and a great historian, but he's only very lightly touched it, even in his most recent book, The Forgotten War. If it's a war, there are two sides. There are great generals and strategists on both sides. No strategists among Aborigines have ever been recognised. I wanted to do that. I wanted to do it for Frank Budbee. And I wanted to do it for myself. And I suddenly saw Anita as this catalyst. Here she was, an Aboriginal leader in Hamburg, and here I was embedded amongst all these academics. The young people, the PhD people, they were all really keen to talk about the Holocaust and really keen to talk about Aboriginal dispossession in Australia. The people of my age, the old professors and those people, I thought, right, I've got to ask them too. Now, they had, so I started asking them, because I could see how these three things could fit together and in a compelling way, with Anita Heiss as the kind of catalyst drawing them together. And one old professor, old like me, you know, I badgered him. I badgered people to give me an answer and a response. And he burst in tears finally and walked away, and I felt awful. And another one got really angry and started thumping the table, and in the end began almost to defend the Nazis, you know. It was unbelievable, the reactions I got, because I was very persistent and I wasn't polite about it. And I decided I want to understand something. And some of them just said, no, don't worry, I never asked Dad anything. Would you? And then looked at me like, would you? And I thought to myself, my father was in the war for 4 years with the King's Own Scottish Borderers and was badly wounded and sent home in the end. But I remember my brother and I sitting there in front of the fire once, and we were discussing how would you carry on as a soldier if people were jumping out of a trench saying, comrade, I give up. What would you do with these people if you're in the middle of this terrible firefight and people are shooting at you from different directions? What would you do with these prisoners? And we sort of looked at Dad, like we didn't actually say, what did you do with prisoners? And he threw his paper down, got up and said, we didn't take prisoners, you bloody fools, and walked out of the room and slammed the door. And that was all he ever told us about his war experience. And immediately we were sort of frozen with the realisation he's saying we shot them in cold blood, presumably, or hot blood or whatever. On that, we didn't take prisoners. We must presumably have killed them. So supposing you found out that your father... when I came back to Australia, there was an old friend who was living on the Gold Coast now. She was retired, and I went to see her, and we had dinner, and I said to her, nobody ever asked you. I know because we were old friends together. She was a German. No one ever asked you what your dad did during the war. And she went white. I said, "Come on, tell us, what did he do?" And she started trembling. She's an old lady like me. And she said, he was in the Waffen-SS in Poland. But it was just doing paperwork, Alex. And then she started to cry, of course. So that was pretty terrible of me to force her to answer that question. And when I got home, she wrote to me a really beautiful letter saying, "Thank you, no one ever asked me. No one ever made me answer that question before. At last, I said it." You know, very moving, very beautiful. But I knew when I was writing this book, and I understood that to ask the question, and the bit that Ray just read, where the young boy colludes with the denial. He colludes with the silence for the sake of his mum and dad and the family. How can you ask? Supposing you get the answer, supposing they tell you, yeah, I was one of the people who perpetrated and helped to organise the Holocaust. Supposing he told you that, you would live to live with that for the rest of your life, and your family would be finished. So, you know, some of these old professors said, "Alex, we never asked. Of course we didn't ask," as if I would already understand all that, which I don't think I did at the time. I hadn't quite empathised to that degree. But that's the sort of challenge that was involved in it. When Anita and I were back in Australia, and the book was being launched in Sydney at a bookshop, she held the book up and she said, "You guys, right? I'm Vita." All right? No mistake about that. That's who I am. So I just put it straight in the book as Anita was Vita. And she loved it and launched the book for me.
It seems to me that when I read that book, and I thought one of its most profound lessons about when one thinks about people who have committed great crimes, or if one discovers that someone one had deeply loved or admired had committed terrible crimes or been in one way or another seriously complicit with them, there's always the temptation to think that there must be, if they did, well, let's suppose they did commit the crimes, it's not a question of whether, then there's a temptation to think that there must have been something about them, some psychological factor that in principle one could discover which would explain why they did it and others didn't. And that one's tempted to think, if only one had seen it beforehand, one would have realised that they were the kind of person capable of doing these terrible things. And one's inclined to think that just must be true, because after all they did it. But for me, one of the most profound lessons of reading Landscaper for Well was there's the realisation this might not be true. There's no must about it. There may be absolutely nothing to be found that will answer the question, how could they have done it? Sometimes, of course, there will be. You can see all brutish things in their character and so on. But sometimes the most frightening lesson is that there may be nothing to find, not because we haven't got the psychological understanding to find it, but simply because there's nothing there that will explain how it were possible that such a person could do such terrible things. And it's always been with us, the lesson of the Holocaust. After all, it's supposed to be the big lesson of the Holocaust, that ordinary people can do the most awful, terrible things. But I think, despite having everybody having acknowledged that's the lesson, we haven't taken the deeper lesson, which I think comes out in this book. That it's not, they are, yes, genuinely ordinary people. And there may be nothing whatsoever psychologically interesting to say about them, which would explain why in the end they became terrible people, either through what they did or through what they refused to condemn or even cheered on and supported. And for having learnt that lesson, I who've thought quite a lot about the Holocaust in my life, I feel very grateful to Alex. I don't know if we've got a couple of minutes for him, because you see, one of the things where I read the bit where Frank said the voice came to you from the old people. And
Panya.
Panya's voice.
Well, we might say the unconscious.
Yeah, but you've often spoken of how voices have come to you and seized you.
I have pills to try and keep control of that.
Obviously, but here, this wonderful voice of Bobby Blue. Here, just read a little bit. And we've got 3 minutes according to that clock. Because I want people to just see.
The thing about Coal Creek, though, is that, it took me 10 weeks to write that book, from the idea to the completed book, and there really wasn't any editing to be done, because I seemed to just listen to the story as he told it to me, and I thought it was going to be a short story. In fact, I said to Ross Donlan, who many of you will know, a poet who usually lives in Castlemaine but is at the moment living in Malmo or somewhere up in the northern hemisphere, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him roughly that there was this little story that I was kind of thinking about, and I said I won't be doing it, though, because I want to write about Hazel Rowley, who was a good friend who died shockingly, suddenly, only a couple of years ago, and I felt I should write about her. And he said, but you must do something with that story, the Coal Creek story. You can't just leave it. It's such a fantastic story, Alex. You know how hard it is to get good stories. And he said, why don't you write it as a short story? So I said, all right, I'll go home and do that this Arvo. And I really meant it.
Sorry, this book, I spilt water on it.
You've been defacing my book.
Just read on from there.
No. Just those 2 lines?
Yeah, well, no, half a page. We'll go for a couple of minutes. I want Alex to do this because it shows.
I don't know really that I can do this.
A remarkable writer.
Virginia Woolf said, whatever you do, don't read my work aloud. And one reason for that is that we all have the perfect inner voice. I did not weep out at the yards that day. I heard my mother had been dead a week, but I wept when I was on my own later. And since that day I have wept for my mother many times, thinking of her love for us all and her special regard for me that I was never to know again from any woman but one. Me and Dad buried my mother up there in the cemetery behind the town reservoir, and everyone in town come to her funeral and walked up the hill behind me and Dad and Ben and his dad, who was all carrying a coffin, which weighed very little. At the graveside I seen my dad was weeping, his hat held in his hands in front of him, his face uncovered to the crowd, and his grief at the loss of his beloved companion plain for everyone to see, and no shame in him. It was the only time I ever seen my dad weep, and it moved me greatly, and my grief caught me in the chest, and I wept with him. Charlie, my brother, he did not get back from the coast for it. I can read the next 300 pages, actually.
Okay, we're 2 seconds to go. And we've got a clock here. No seconds to go. So, I really want you to thank Alex. I hope I've chosen bits of his writings and that will enable you to see what a wonderful writer you have in this area.
And I think we should thank Ray
the world
too.
has in Alex.
I've been looking forward to this and dreading it. No. No, that's amazing. We have a wonderful friendship, folks, and we're very lucky, and we know how lucky we are to have friendships. The most important thing. Thank you.